Well, good afternoon, folks. I thought today we'll give you a little guided tour around my Pentax ME Super. This camera I purchased back in 1984. In its time it was probably relatively high spec. The first thing you see about the camera is it takes this type of memory card, which another name for it is a film. Nothing to be said about that. The fact that very few film cameras now are being used, unfortunately. But digital does have its sort of market share, I think, now. But anyway, enough about the film. The first thing you can see about the camera here, and this, sorry, is a little accessory that is, I think, a must for the camera. But I'll demonstrate that a bit later on. So the first thing you see about the camera is how small it is. This one is got the Pentax f1.7 50mm lens on the front. But then where else would it be, I suppose? So the first thing you see at the front of the camera is, and in the hand, how small it is. This little thing here, I mean, I'll probably bring the camera slightly closer to. That is the self timer. I think it's around about 12 seconds. But one of the rather strange things about this is that it's clockwork, as you can see there or hear there. Nothing modern about that, unfortunately, but it worked very well. So looking at the top of the camera there, I use the lens as a handle there. The first thing you see, this is the film advance lever with a standoff there, which most cameras with film had. Standoff there. That is what one would call the command dial. Actually, if I turn it around, you probably, that's the way you'll be seeing it. That's the command dial. So within the top position is L. It's for lock. That basically locks all the shutter release up. The second position is auto, because it's an aperture priority camera with a manual override. You basically sit it in auto, and then you adjust the aperture, which will automatically make the shutter speed go up and down depending on the aperture that you've set. So hence the name aperture priority, because you're giving priority to whatever the aperture that you need. Then you come down to M, which is manual. It's a metered manual, and then to get the correct exposure you can then use the shutter speed or an aperture. This camera is quite unique in its time because it had a push button shutter speed selection there. Most cameras would have had a shutter speed selection around the dial here. You would then dial in the shutter speed that you required, and then adjusted the aperture here to get a series of LEDs in the viewfinder to move up and down until they were green. That was the usual sort of a practice, which would then show that you had the correct aperture to match the shutter speed that you selected. This is pretty much the same way you do it, that you by pushing these buttons up or down, you can move the shutter speed up or down. So you'll push that up or down to select the shutter speed that you would require for the type of picture that you were taking. Obviously, the higher the shutter speed for fast moving objects, and things that were more static, more stationary, you would use a slower shutter speed. But once you dialed in the shutter speed that you would require, you would then select the aperture until you had a green LED in the viewfinder that would then obviously give you the correct shutter speed. In the auto mode, you could basically the shutter speeds would go up and down, and you would have a next to the LED a corresponding shutter speed. So you can actual fact, by dialing the aperture up and down, you could affect the shutter speed. So if you wanted a faster one, you could dial a fast shutter speed in using the aperture ring, but then obviously you would have a wider aperture, and reverse. For slower shutter speeds, you could have a larger aperture, or smaller aperture, sorry, larger number. But that was basically how it worked. I must admit that I never really used it in manual. I found it much easier to use it in in aperture priority, but it's probably just me being rather lazy in that situation. But moving on to the rest of the top plate here, this here is your film speed. There's no DX film speed on this camera, so every time you loaded a film you had to obviously check that you were using the right film speed setting in here to correspond to the film speed that you'd loaded, and you change that by lifting up the collar basically here and turning it round. You could, in actual fact, sort of add in between, you could have an ASA 300 film dial in there, but that obviously didn't really happen. The film's not made at that speed, but you could actually use this as a simpler way of exposure compensation. But that's what you did with that. On the note of exposure compensation, you could turn this dial here and add a little bit plus or minus exposure compensation there, to continually over or underexpose the picture. If you're at an air show, for instance, and you're photographing planes against a grey sky, you would overexpose it a bit, perhaps 1 or 2 stops by dialing that, so that you would wash out the sky, but the darker plane against that background would then be more detailed. Modern SLRs, digital SLRs, you can actually dial that in a much simpler way, but it does exactly the same. And on the top here, this thing here, that's your rewind, and to open the back of the film you pop that up to that position and then just pop it once more, and that pops the back. And in there, as you can see, is nothing much to tell in there apart from the shutters in the middle and Pentax's magic needles. And what you did, you loaded the film leader into there, and then I used to place my thumb on the film, pull it across the back, drop it in, snap it shut, and then I would then just wind on once to make sure that it was all located in the little lugs on the drive here. Once I was happy with that, I would then snap the back and perhaps wind on once more, and that way you could sometimes get an extra 3 or 4 exposures out of your roll of film. Sometimes the development company would charge you extra, but generally you have a 24 exposure. I regularly got 26 to 27. That's the back of the camera. That's your, this little thing here is a memo holder. Pretty standard again for that era of camera, this era of camera. Hot shoe on the top, very basic hot shoe, not like modern SLRs with various connections for dedicated camera settings and for the camera to control the flash gun and vice versa. But you know, in its day it was an excellent camera and served me very well. In actual fact, still gets the odd outing out now and then. Just moving on, just this little thing here is your, if I can pull the little back plug out, is your flash sync. So if you were doing off hot shoe flash uses, you could actually plug your little sync cord into that, and you could then have an off-camera flash there, which again was you know, if you had a flash bracket or something like that to reduce your red eye, always a useful sort of a thing to have. To remove the lens, pretty straightforward on this camera. Little lever there, just push the lever, rotate the lens anti-clockwise as you look at it, and that's the lens removed. Again, nothing around the lens for here. Again, modern SLRs would have various connections around here, but this one doesn't. This little red dot here enables you to line the film, the lens up with the camera, and on there, and then you can see a red dot there, and you just line that up with the 2 red dots together. And then a little simple thing that Pentax very cleverly did, that this little white foot, if you like, here, which is very pronounced, if you line that up with the film, the lens release button there, again, that you could then snap it shut. So that was ideal if it was dark, really. You know, if you couldn't see the red dot, you just lined up the little pin there with the lever for opening the lens, and could easily do it in the dark, which is a great feature. Now in the bottom of the camera, standard tripod socket. That's the battery compartment. That takes two LR44 button cells, which I believe you can still get. I've got quite a few in stock just in case you can't. This little pin here, when you come to the end of the film and you wanted to rewind it, to release the mechanism so you could rewind the film, you just push that in and it enabled you to rewind the film back into the case. This thing here, which I'm now going to remove because that is the next part of the demonstration. It's a little bit fiddly. The coin is better. Well, the old-fashioned 5p pieces would be a much better thing for this. But in the bottom there, again, I don't know if you can see, there's a little a gear affair, a little drive gear, and that is for the Pentax ME2 winder, which I'm now going to show you there. So I just put the camera to one side. This is the ME2 winder. Pretty light, but when you added the batteries, and this one takes the, I can remember at home, it's a long time since I've used the camera. It's like that. So this takes 4 AA cells in the bottom, and I believe you can also use rechargeables in it. But basically 4 AA cells and last for months and months. So that just drops on the back, locks in. Again, that's now got another tripod thread for itself. This little gadget here, that pushes the pin in the bottom of the camera, which I showed you earlier, to rewind the film, because that we would leave permanently fixed to the camera. And looking on the top of it, that's the gear drive that fits in the bottom of the camera. This little recess here, you would actually screw in the cover for the drive into there to keep it safe. Another little clever idea from Pentax. There's your mounting, because it goes onto the tripod mount, and connections there for the camera for the drive, etc, etc, etc. And one thing you notice about the camera is how small it is, and I did find it, I've got quite small hands, and I did find it very uncomfortable to use. But by placing on the winder, which is just a simple matter of lining it up with the tripod there, tripod mount, making sure when you get it's all nicely lined up, and you just put it on, screw it on there. And just before it sort of came to a tight fit, I always used to give it just a little, make sure that the connections were all nicely dropped in, because they were spring loaded, and double check it. And now the camera now is a much better fit in the hands. So you can see it certainly adds weight to it, and again with the batteries in, it adds a lot more weight, but that's not a bad thing. It just makes it a much more solid piece of equipment to use. This little red light here, basically when you trip the shutter and it all winds on, this glows red, so you can see it that it's all moving, though you can actually hear it. It will, if you're up to the maximum shutter speed of 0.02 of a second, this will take 2 frames every second. So it's not a slouch, but the speed of it is really dependent on the shutter speed that you've got set. The controls here mimic basically most of what's on the top. So it's off is in the middle, single, which is single frame. Press it once and you fire, you have to press it again to fire the shutter again, or continuous. As long as you hold that down, it will just keep going until you run out of film or batteries. In here there's a little dial here which moves this here. If you see that there, as I said, 125th or auto. When you're in normal use, you set it on auto. If you're using the flash, 125th of a second, because this camera flash syncs at 125th, as most cameras over time synced at 60th. Again, so you just push the little white pin down here and you can move it on round. So when you're doing flash, you always have this set at 125th of a second there, and then that's set at 125th if you're using the winder and the flash. and it all syncs. Other than that, just push the pin down into there, and I'll again leave it set on manual. This must all go back to auto, and obviously turn it on or off. You remove the top here, and this it's not been off for a long time. In there is a little socket with 3 pins, and in there you can add a remote release, which I believe was a 20 meter cable that you could do basically the same as your cable release, but it did it through the winder. The cable release would screw into the top there. This remote release screwed into there with a collar, and it did exactly the same as your cable release. It made it made more sense, I suppose, to do that way, because the cable releases were very short. And as you can see, the winder on it adds a much better setup to the camera. The lens on this one is the Pentax f1.7 50mm lens. I think that was a pretty standard lens to be sold with the camera. And just to put sort of into perspective, when I bought this camera in 1984, it was £149, including the lens. The winder, which I bought about 6 months after, I believe was I believe was £56, including 4 AA batteries. So that was, one could argue, a week's wages there for me at the time. But it certainly served me very, very well in all the photography until I went over to digital, and it still does get an outing now and then. I'll just show you again to remove the drive. You just unscrew it and pop it off, and that's the drive removed. And again, just screw in the cover. It can be a bit fiddly because the threads are very, very fine, and obviously you don't want to cross thread anything. But that basically is it. I hope I've sort of covered a few things. It just started to rain now. It's going to get rather noisy, so I'm going to sign off. And so I hope you've enjoyed my little tour of the ME Super. I've tried my best to explain as much as I can about the camera, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching, and bye bye for now.